So hello everyone and welcome for the last session of Surfing the Ocean. Today we have the pleasure of having one person from Berkeley and one from Dauphine. And so let's dive in. So the first speaker is Serena. She's a last year PhD student under supervision of Michael Jordan from Berkeley, and she's gonna speak about on counterfactual metric for social welfare. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And actually, I'll update that I just defended last week, so now I'm freshly graduated now.
Congratulations.
But thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited and happy to be here to be presenting some work that was done very recently. We just presented this at AI Stats also like a few weeks ago. This is joint work with Stephen Bates, P. Aronow, and also Mike Jordan, of course. And this work, I've just found really interesting because I've been personally very interested in this issue of the metrics that we use to evaluate machine learning systems don't actually always match broader social welfare and social outcomes. So today I'm going to talk about a specific way in which we look at metrics and social welfare. And it kind of brings together different kinds of, it's kind of a very interdisciplinary type of project where we brought in ideas from causal inference and econometrics and also principal agent theory and all the way over to like public policy type of thinking. As I said earlier, I think I'm going to try to make the main speaking part of this 30 minutes. If you have like any major clarifying questions in the middle, feel free to interrupt and ask those. Otherwise, I'll try to save time at the end for a more substantive discussion. Okay, so to motivate this work, I'm going to start by talking a bit about ranking systems. So ranking systems are used in almost all domains very widely to help people make all kinds of decisions, from say like where you're going to go to college, where you're going to go to school, what restaurants you're going to eat at. And in particular, a particularly high impact version of this is in the US, there's quite a lot of, there's been quite a bit of development of ranking systems for health purposes. So what I'm showing here is a screenshot from this tool called Cal Hospital Compare, where what you can do here is, this is like a California tool, but there's these at different kinds of national and local levels in the US, where it's just a search box and you can type in any kind of procedure here and what will spit back out is a ranked list of hospitals. So what patients will do is like look up what kind of procedure they want to have, use tools like this to help decide what hospitals to go to. So these tools are quite, they're built with the best of intentions, right? You want to help support patients in making their decisions. Even things like, Google Maps, it's like built to try to make your restaurant decisions easier. But it turns out that the kinds of rankings that come out or the results, like they don't always end up, there's like a question here of, do the results that come out actually end up being useful to you? Are they the best results that you can get? And sometimes they're based on metrics that may not actually reflect what's going on under the hood. So here they even advertise this as ratings you can trust. But the question I'm going to pose now is, like, when you type something in and get back a ranked list, can you really trust that list? What does that really even mean? So in particular, a challenge that will come up here is the fact that, okay, these rankings are based on some numerical metrics under the hood, but these metrics are also subject to interactions with agents in the system, right? So one way to summarize this is like this kind of phenomenon is well known in the social sciences as Goodhart's law, which says when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this is just one version of this kind of adage that has shown up in all sorts of different kinds of social science contexts, from education to monetary policy to social program evaluation. But this is also just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what can happen here. And more generally, data and metrics that kind of feed into these kinds of ranking systems live in an ecosystem of stakeholders that all have asymmetric information, power, and values, and all of whom may interact with the ranking system and with each other. So this leads to kind of a complexity to this system that can, distort the metrics and vice versa. So let me give a more concrete example here and do a deeper dive to in this particular healthcare example to see how these interactions can affect the ratings that come out. So in particular, we have that these kinds of ranking systems are built from metrics that are gathered about hospitals and doctors. And then these metrics are viewed by patients who then can interact with the system and decide which hospitals to go to. And already with just these actors, these agents, we're going to see some asymmetries. So, okay, let me say real quickly, like some examples of metrics that get used in these ranking systems are mortality rates, readmission rates for the hospitals, like C-section rates, treatment costs, things like that. And already what we're going to have here is that we have some asymmetries now in information, power, and values, where patients on seeing this information can decide which hospitals and doctors to go to. Hospitals and doctors also have their own expertise in treatment, and they're the ones who decide how to treat patients. And this leads to, again, distorting these metrics and also metrics distorting the actions that agents in the system take. And this has been documented in the health economics literature as well. Making things even more complicated here, these metrics, at least in the US, are collected by the government. So in particular, we have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a government health agency that gathers all this data, publishes these metrics. And what happens here is that like CMS also has additional power in the system where they have the ability to compensate doctors and hospitals. And also they're the insurer, they're also an insurer for patients. So what this means is that this like compensation can also distort the metrics and also lead to kind of an information asymmetry where the type of data that they get as the insurer differs from like the type of data that like doctors and hospitals are operating with. And again, who's kind of building these ranking systems in the first place? Well, it turns out that that's yet another third party here, or fifth party, I guess, in this plot, where here, like I'm showing a screenshot from Cal Hospital Compare, that's just one specific kind of organization or company that aggregates data from CMS or these kinds of metrics from CMS and turns them into these ranking systems. And each of these, independent entities has their own objectives and, utility and need to stay open. Okay, so of course, there's many more stakeholders and interactions that can show up in the health setting. Here, I'm just showing 5, but there's way more than this and much more. But what I'm trying to show here is just the surface of like the complexity that can happen in the system. So at the end of the day, after seeing this, we can ask ourselves, okay, can we really trust these ratings? In short, I don't know. I mean, I want to hope so. But what I'm going to show today is some work towards, okay, can we get at that problem a bit by zooming in on some particular subsets of interactions here to try to understand, okay, can we take some steps towards understanding whether we can trust these ratings and how we can improve that trust? So in today's talk in particular, I'm going to be focusing on strategic behavior. And I'm going to ask, oh, sorry. Yeah.
You said, so can we ask, how do you formulate, like, can we ask these ratings in the sense, like, can we trust that the participants are not gonna try to fool the system, try to adapt some strategies in order to optimize the benchmark that you're choosing, or so trying to see if like you can trust your participants, or is this that you're trying to measure?
Oh yeah, so I think I think that will become more clear as I get into like a very specific example of what our work does. But on a high level, that is kind of the flavor of question that I'm interested in here. So yeah, like what are the kinds of ways that other agents will interact with the system, and what does this mean for the measures? But I'll make it more concrete, like what I mean by trust in just a second. Okay, so yeah, so maybe it would help for me to like actually get into what model we use here. So specifically, we're looking at I'm going to focus on a specific set of interactions that's based on some papers that I've seen from kind of the health economics literature that's documents like the empirical kinds of effects that can show up here that have had I'll get to an actual example in a second. So our goal, though, is to ask, okay, how do we, the piece in which we're trying to intervene is to think about the metrics themselves. So how do we improve quality metrics that feed into these ranking systems when agents can act strategically? And I'm going to define improve in just a moment. And okay, so specifically, again, yeah, I'm going to look at a specific set of interactions that has been documented in the health economics literature. And to set that scene, I'm going to give an example from the early 90s in the US, where at this time in the US, at least in the health system, there was quite a big push to, again, add more data, more accountability metrics into the health system to like kind of improve transparency for patients, kind of improve visibility of how hospitals were operating. So what happened in the early 90s was that the New York Health Department started to mandate that hospitals publish mortality rate metrics for different surgeries that they performed, with the idea being that this is supposed to say, again, increase transparency, help patients decide where to go, also motivate hospitals to say do better, right? But unfortunately, things didn't actually turn out better for patients after these were mandated. And in fact, what this work Dranov et al. Found was that more severely ill patients ended up actually experiencing dramatically worsened health outcomes after these mortality rate measures were mandated. So specifically, they found that actually hospital readmissions rates got worse for more severely ill patients, and even mortality rates got worse. So why did this happen? I mean, the intention was that this was supposed to improve patient outcomes. Well, what these economists, Dranov et al. Pointed to was the fact that one mechanism by which this could have happened is the fact that hospitals exercise selection power over what patients they choose to treat. So the treatment policy gets chosen by the hospital. And what you find is that what they found was that actually after these mortality rate metrics were mandated, the distribution of treated patients shifted more towards healthier patients rather than sicker patients. Since that's what's actually going to improve your mortality rate metric, right? It's if you're treating healthier patients who are more likely to have better outcomes. Okay, and this also, so that was like in the 90s. Today, these kinds of metrics in the US at least have only grown. So now we have, as I mentioned earlier, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services who've invested over $1 billion in collecting measures like this, like mortality rates. And also the impact of these measures has also grown via these kinds of online ranking systems that I mentioned earlier, where now you don't just have these measures like being used to, say, compensate a hospital, but they feed into these rating systems like Cal Hospital Compare or even like the US News and World Report that affect patient decisions as well. And as this kind of impact has grown, so has a growing literature emerged that like is questioning the relationship between metrics like mortality rates and wider patient outcomes. Okay, and let me quickly mention here that I've been using health as a running example, but this kind of selection mechanism shows up in many other settings as well. One that we're all probably very familiar with is education, where it's well known and well established that universities exercise selection power over what students they admit. And this then informs what kinds of measures are collected about them, which then feeds into their rankings. And many other examples of this kind of pattern in different kinds of commercial settings as well. So in this kind of specific selection mechanism, we're going to ask 3 key questions here, and maybe this will get back at, maybe make more concrete exactly what we're going to do. So the first question we're going to ask is one of incentives. So first, how do we design quality metrics that go into these ranking systems that are going to lead to better treatment incentives, that are going to incentivize basically the hospital to have a treatment policy that aligns with social welfare? The second question we're going to look at is a question of ranking, where we're going to ask, okay, do rankings based on those quality metrics behave reasonably in a way that might be useful to patients? And then third, I'm going to talk a bit about information asymmetry, where this is going to be a really core technical question here, where what if hospitals actually know more about the patients that they're treating than the regulatory agencies do? Okay, so let's start by asking this incentives question. So in order to do that, I'm going to bring in some tools from economics, principal agent model in particular. And this is particularly useful for modeling these kinds of asymmetries in power, information, values of the system. I guess folks here are probably quite familiar with this, so I can probably go. But for anyone who hasn't seen a principal agent model before, at a high level, a principal agent model is useful for modeling asymmetric information, where the agent is really the expert in completing a task. They know more about the task itself and their own effort than a principal does. So here we can think of the principal as, say, the health department who's trying to evaluate a hospital, and the agent is the hospital who's treating patients. We also have this kind of asymmetric actions, where the principal has the ability to set a contract that determines the agent's reward. So in our setting, we can think of the contract as like the principal deciding how to evaluate the hospital. So what kind of quality metric they're going to set, and how much compensation to give for that. And then the agent is the one that actually gets to do the treatment. Okay, so making this more specific and concrete to our setting, the model that, so here's exactly what we do. So in our case, we consider the health department to have the following observables. So we say that the principal of the health department observes for, say, N patients that come through, the covariates for those patients, where by covariates here, I just mean the patient characteristics X. So this is like each patient's prior medical history, their like demographic information, et cetera. The principal gets to observe the treatment that got assigned to each patient. So here I'm going to assume that treatment T is binary as well. So either treated or untreated. And the principal also gets to observe the outcomes that happen for the patient. And I'm going to assume that this outcome is potentially missing if the patient went untreated. And knowing these observables, the principal gets to choose a reward function W, where this is a function of these observable variables. And so we can think of this reward function as that quality metric from before. So maybe this reward function here, W, could be a mortality rate, or it could be something else. Okay, the agent or the hospital, on the other hand, will get to observe the covariates for all the patients that come through again. So that's patient characteristics. But the agent, again, being the expert in their own task, is going to know a lot more about their own abilities to treat the patient. And specifically, I'm going to assume here that the agent knows the conditional average potential outcomes if they treated or didn't treat a patient. So mu0 of X represents the expected outcome condition, the conditional average potential outcome, where this is the potential outcome under not treating. And then mu1 of X is the potential outcome if treated, conditioned on characteristics X. That's why I say conditional average potential outcome. Okay, so knowing this, now the agent gets to choose a treatment rule, pi, where pi of X is this function represents the probability that the agent treats a given patient, conditioned on them having characteristics X. So I'm assuming here a stochastic treatment rule, which is fairly common in the policy learning kind of literature. And okay, given that this is kind of the information landscape, the stackable game that we have is that we have the principal moves first by choosing a reward function W. So you can think of this as like, okay, the New York Health Department got to decide what metrics they were going to collect about the hospitals and what they were going to publish. So that was like a mortality rate from before. And the agent of the hospital moves second with a best response to that reward function. And they best respond with a treatment rule that here I'm going to assume maximizes the expectation of that reward function over those variables that we just showed. So here, again, there's an assumption here that we have a risk neutral agent. Future work is to relax that. For now, we just have that the treatment rule maximizes this expectation. Okay, so the principal's goal then in this game is going to be to design a reward that maximizes a welfare effect notion. Okay, so yeah, here I'm crystallizing, okay, what exactly do I mean by a better quality metric here? So welfare effect here is a function that I'm drawing from the policy learning and policy evaluation literature, where here this is a function of the treatment rule pi, v of pi. And what it is I'm looking at the expectation of the outcomes under the treatment rule minus the outcomes if no one were to get treated. So you can think of this as basically what is the additional value that a given hospital's treatment policy is adding to society compared to if they didn't exist at all. And maximizing this is equivalent to maximizing utilitarian welfare here, where with respect to like just the expectation of the outcome Y. And for notational purposes, I'm also going to define a notion of regret here, where regret is just going to simply be the welfare effect of the best possible treatment policy minus the welfare effect of the policy that got optimized for a chosen reward function W that the principal would have chosen. So again, the goal here is to maximize this V of pi function, minimize regret, and those would be equivalent. Okay, so now that we've set all this notation up, let's take this and apply this to that first example we just talked about, where we had this mortality rate metric from the New York Health Department that led to like worse patient outcomes, right? So here, the mortality rate measure actually can be more generally written as what I'm going to call an average treated outcome, where we're just averaging outcomes over like a set of treated individuals. And it turns out that this kind of pattern of metric is very widely used in many different kinds of settings, mainly because it's fairly simple to implement, right? You're just like averaging an outcome over like the data that you have that got treated. So, okay, in the stackable game that we just set up, the agent's best response to this, probably as expected here, nothing really surprising, is to treat only the patients with the highest expected treated outcome. So this kind of tracks with what Dranovic et al. Found with like this leads to treating healthier patients rather than sicker ones. And what we show with respect to those kinds of that welfare effect and the regret notion that we just gave is that, well, regret as we just defined it is going to be unbounded. So this is kind of as expected. So how can we do better than this? Is kind of one of the central questions of our work. So what we show is that we can make two changes to that total treatment reward function to reduce regret as we defined it. So in particular, the first change that we're going to make is in the numerator, I'm going to add an estimate of the untreated potential outcome. So I'm going to add an estimate here, mu hat 0 of x represents an estimate of what would have happened if a patient went untreated with characteristics x. So the idea here is that if you have, say, a sicker patient, this mu hat 0 of x should be lower, and so you should have a higher difference in the numerator. This should curb some of that gaming behavior, whereas a healthier patient should have a higher mu hat 0 of x if your estimator is good. The second change we need to make is to remove that denominator so that we reward the agent for treating more patients. And what we end up with now is a reward function, which we call a total treatment effect here. And the agent's best response now in an unconstrained world is going to be to treat all patients with a positive treatment effect. And so this is going to be optimal in an unconstrained setting. In a constrained setting, the agent's best response is going to be to treat if they have a budget constraint of treating some subset of patients, then that subset will be the set with the highest treatment effects. So I'm going to note here that the main difference between this and the previous best response too is that we're treating patients with a positive treatment effect rather than just a positive treated with like the highest treated outcomes. And so the regret here for this reward function is going to be 0 as long as that mu hat 0 of x estimator is good, as long as that's an unbiased estimate of the untreated potential outcome. So kind of good news and bad news here, stepping back for a second. Like the nice thing about this is that these are two relatively simple changes to an existing reward function that's being very widely used. So maybe that's like helpful from a implementation standpoint when bringing this to say, oh, here's how you should do things differently. But simple doesn't always mean easy. And the difficulty here is the fact that, okay, we need to estimate this untreated potential outcome, this mu hat 0 of x function, and that is not a trivial problem by any means. In fact, it's a causal inference problem that's going to rely on some very key important kind of identification assumptions. And if we have more time maybe at the end, I'm going to come back and talk more specifically about those assumptions. What gets pretty interesting here is like, depending on the data source that you get this from, you could even have like incentive or agency kind of strategic behavior that affects those identification assumptions. But more generally, let me just that doesn't necessarily have to happen. So I'll just leave this at like, this is a causal inference problem, your standard causal identification assumptions are going to apply here when estimating this function.
Can I have just one question? Sorry,
yeah.
I don't understand why the second. Why do you need the second change? So why you stop considering the average between the treatment that you consider? Like, yes, that's why. Why do you need to remove the denominator in the end?
Excellent, great question. Okay, so if I leave this denominator here, what you actually end up with, if I were to take the expectation of this quantity, is something that also has a name in causal inference, the average treatment effect on the treated. So it's otherwise known as the ATT. That is, so actually we do address this in the paper. So we show in the paper that you can do that. And what you get though is that, okay, the agent's best response now, if you like, let's think for a second about what the agent's best response is going to be if we had this denominator. So the agent now wants to maximize their average treatment effect over the treated patients, right? So that means that they're going to only treat, like the best, one way to do that is to only treat the subset of patients with the highest treatment effect. So even in an unconstrained world, they're going to try to only treat the patients with the highest treatment effect, because that's like, you know, that then because you're dividing by like the ones that you treat, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, what we show is that you get bounded regret, but you don't get zero regret.
Just
good question. Yeah.
If you do you hear me?
Oh yeah, there's a bit of an echo.
Yeah.
Eric, tu peux. Okay, is it does it work? Sorry. If you remove the denominator here, here, don't you go against some cost constraints or constraints on the number of people that you can treat?
Yes. Okay.
Will you end up with something unrealizable?
Great question. Okay, so good question. So one like way in which we've addressed this in the like we've modeled this at least at first is to say, okay, suppose that the hospital has a budget constraint over like here's just the number of patients that they can treat. So it's not necessarily like a numerical cost constraint, but like here's, you know, I can't treat more than K patients. Then that shows up through, then you still, that actually everything still kind of goes through in that setting where you just now have like a you know, the agent is maximizing the expectation of this subject to the number of patients that they can treat. And then you get that like that, you know, up to that budget, they sort by like, or one optimal solution there is to sort by treatment effects and then cut off at the budget. One, like, I think maybe one part of your question that, I'm not sure if this is part of your question, but like, are you asking too, like, how do you account for the cost of treatment? Or
like if we don't say that we have if we don't have the term in the denominator, maybe we end up with something like undoable for the hospital. And like if we take constraints, does it relate to what we have with the denominator? Maybe it's not so clear.
Yeah, so I think like with what you want is that like, okay, so the way that we would want to set this up is to say, okay, what do we actually, what's the like ideal treatment policy for the agent subject to constraints? So this will be like the what is like the max overall welfare effect that you can get subject to the agent's constraints. And we want to compare that to like, what does it look like for the agent to maximize this function subject to some constraints, right? So in that case, like, yeah, like it shouldn't, it's always going to be better to like apply the agent's constraints to this function versus the other.
Yeah, then putting the.
Yeah, like then putting those constraints on like some other function that's like not.
Thank you.
But yeah, thank you for listening too. So I want to be mindful of time since I know we may be. Let me be mindful of time. Maybe we can come back to some more of the discussion towards the end. So I want to actually, how much time do you think I have left? Maybe like
you have 10 minutes.
Great. Okay, that's funny. Perfect. Okay, good. Because I really want to get to this question of ranking here, where this is how we started out motivating this whole thing. I mean, we just set up all this like principal agent scaffolding, but where I think like really some of the payoff of this work here is thinking about, okay, let's see, and where I think there's actually been a lot less attention in the literature is saying, okay, how do these metrics feed into ranking systems and feeding into these ranking systems, which are then used by patients to make decisions, right? So here I'm going to ask specifically, do rankings that are based on the quality measures that we just talked about, those like functions W, are they going to behave reasonably from a patient's standpoint? After all, like in reality, this is actually what happens. Like you have these mortality rate metrics, you have hospitals that are directly ranked based on like their performance in the mortality rate metrics, or even universities that are directly ranked, right? And so to what extent is that actually useful to those who are making decisions based on these? Okay, so we're in this paper, what we do is we start with just a super basic question here of, we just want to ask, do rankings behave reasonably? And we start with a really basic ranking desideratum, which just simply says, by reasonably, we mean that our better hospitals ranked higher. And what I'm going to ask here is, to kind of give a preview, which to get you guys thinking about this question is, we just presented that total treatment reward function. We said that, okay, solving like this relies on a causal inference subproblem. If we assume that all of the identification assumptions are good, we can, like, assuming that my causal estimand or my causal estimator like is unbiased, is that perfect reward function going to satisfy this very basic ranking desideratum of ranking better hospitals higher? Okay, so let me make this a bit more concrete. So more specifically, when I say better hospitals should be ranked higher, more formally, we give two definitions for this. So the first definition I'm going to give is what I'll call uniform rank preservation, which simply says if hospital 1 is uniformly better than hospital 2 for all patients with different characteristics X, so across all different realizations of X, then my reward function W or my ranking function W should be higher for hospital 1 than for hospital 2. Okay, so here we have hospital 1 is better than hospital 2 for all X. And where better, I mean conditional average treatment effect. Okay, this might not be realistic most of the time because you don't always have that like one hospital is uniformly better than another. So we relax this to give a second definition, which I'll call relative rank preservation, which says if hospital 1 is better than hospital 2 on average across some reference population, then hospital 1 should be ranked above hospital 2. So here we have, like in this plot, hospital 1 is better for some patients, hospital 2 is better for others. But if I were to take an average of this over a uniform distribution over X, then we would have that hospital 1 should be ranked higher. Okay, so having defined those two just very basic notions of better hospitals should be ranked higher, I'm going to now ask, does that total treatment reward function that we just presented satisfy these ranking, like those two definitions? In the interest of time, I'm going to give a spoiler. So the short answer is no, actually. So we just talked about all those incentives, right? But this actually doesn't satisfy those two ranking desiderata. And I'm going to give two complications or two reasons why. So the first you may have already anticipated, which is just that we're going to have an advantage for larger hospitals with this reward function, right? Since I'm summing over n and I'm not normalizing by n. So that's fairly easily fixed. Just put a 1 over n here, right? But as written, this is going to give an advantage to larger hospitals. A second, more subtle issue here, which is like a little bit harder to fix, is the fact that, well, different hospitals actually serve different patient populations. And in particular, this reward function will give an advantage to hospitals that serve easier patient populations. So where easier is any distributions over X in which there is a better treatment effect. So that includes, say, higher income patients or maybe younger patients. Yeah, so that is like a little bit more subtle here. And this is like quite a big problem in the US where you have like different hospitals in all different like kinds of locales with different kinds of populations. Okay, so a solution to both of those issues that will satisfy those ranking desiderata is to simply add a reweighting term here. So this is one thing we do in the paper. So we take that total treatment reward function we just presented. Now I've added a K to be like, this is that reward function as measured for hospital K. And I'm adding a reweighting term with two parts. So first is just a 1/n normalization for the size of the treatment population. And second is just an importance weighting term, basically. So what I'm doing here is adjusting the metric to some reference population x naught. So in the numerator, I have the density for reference population x naught. The denominator, I have the density for the population that the hospital sees, xk. And what we show here is that, okay, given with this reweighting, we get that, like, okay, now we'll satisfy that ranking desideratum, where hospitals will indeed be ranked higher if they are either uniformly better at treating all patients or better on average for some reference population x naught. So that's nice. We added this reweighting term. Maybe it makes sense that this would satisfy those things. But we also just spent a whole bunch of time talking about incentives. So what I think is really the main key result from this section is the fact that actually this reweighting also preserves those incentive alignment properties that we want, that we talked about. And in fact, not just that reweighting function, I could actually put any positive function here as a reweighting function and still preserve the incentive alignment properties that we talked about in the first part of this talk. And I think this is actually, like, to me, this is one of the most exciting results from this work, because what we now have is a functional form here with via this G function that now we've decoupled the ranking desiderata from that incentive alignment problem that we talked about at the very beginning. So any designer of a ranking system, maybe Cal Hospital Compare, they can choose this G, this weighting function, for whatever policy desiderata that they have for their ranking system. So let me give an example of that. So in particular, a design choice that they might want to make is, what reference population do we want our rankings to work well for? So say your Cal Hospital Compare, maybe by default, you might have that this reference population is a general user population. So maybe the population of the state of California. But what I think is actually particularly cool from getting this functional form is the fact that now you can also personalize the rankings to subpopulations of age, gender, race, income, etc., via this function G, and still have those, and still not worry about breaking the incentive alignment properties from earlier. So we're still going to incentivize the optimal treatment policy and still be able to have personalized rankings. And this personalization issue is one that seems to be quite top of mind for a lot of folks who work in healthcare and health policy. So summarizing kind of a bit of what we have here, what we've shown now is putting these kinds of two parts together. What we've presented is an incentive aligned function class here, where this function class is one that can be used both for ranking and to reward, and as kind of but both for ranking and as a reward function for hospitals. And we've pulled out two modular components of it that are key to the actual operationalizing of this. The first is that we need to learn this u-hat 0 of x function. This becomes a causal inference problem. And second, we have this modular component, this weighting function G, that can be chosen by the ranking system designer to, say, personalize if they want, or for whatever kind of reference population that they need. Okay, so in maybe the last couple minutes before I go to wider questions, I'm going to quickly talk about this issue of information asymmetry. So this is a bit of an elephant in the room here, because this can quite complicate things. So in particular, the form of information asymmetry that I'm going to just very briefly touch on here is, what if the hospitals know more about the patients they're treating than the regulatory agencies do? So in particular, Drenov et al. Even allude to this in their paper. So our model is going to change as follows under this particular flavor of information asymmetry. So the principal of the health department will observe and choose, their action space and information space is the same. The agent, though, I'm going to assume observes a bit more. So in particular, the agent, in addition to observing covariates X about each patient, gets to observe an additional set of covariates U about each patient that comes through, about the patients that come through. And they get to know the expected potential outcomes conditioned on both X and U. And they can also best respond to the reward function with a treatment rule that depends on both X and U. So This, it turns out, leads to complicates the results from earlier. It leads to all sorts of issues. And in particular, let me give two consequences of this information asymmetry relative to that total treatment reward function we just talked about. And some of this might get a little bit subtle here, but you guys might be interested. So the first consequence is that we may see confounding bias in my estimate of mu hat 0, right? So when I'm estimating this untreated potential outcome, mu hat 0 of x, if that's estimated over data that is confounded by u, then this might introduce confounding bias. Now, I say might introduce confounding bias because there could exist data from which to estimate something like this that isn't confounded by u. So that's not a necessary thing. This isn't a necessary issue that comes up via this type of information asymmetry, but it may be, like, say, more likely, let's say. But the really key issue here, the core issue that this information asymmetry introduces, is a problem of unmeasured heterogeneity, where even if I do have an unbiased estimate of mu 0, I'm still only measuring mu 0 of x, conditioned on these characteristics x, but the agent gets to choose their treatment policy based on both x and u. So, like, one way to interpret what I'm gonna show in just a second is that when there is information asymmetry, unconfoundedness in my mu hat 0 estimate is not enough. There's still going to be regret, even if this estimator is unbiased. And in particular, what we give theoretically is upper and lower bounds on regret under information asymmetry. So we show that the regret under that total treatment reward function is basically upper bounded, both upper and lower bounded by a linear function of this degree of unmeasured heterogeneity, where specifically I'm measuring the unmeasured heterogeneity amount is given by just the statistical difference between mu 0 of x and mu 0 of condition on both x and u. And this particular, like, gamma marge, here I'm saying gamma marge is a bound on, like, what is the additional effect of this unmeasured heterogeneity. And it relates to other concepts in causal inference, like sensitivity analysis, as well as bias amplification. Okay, so that kind of here, this is kind of where this particular paper ends, and that we're like, okay, we give these bounds on regret under information asymmetry. We show that at least, if you can figure out how much, or if you can estimate how big this gamma marge quantity is, you can, like, translate that into some upper and lower bounds on your regret. It's nice in that sense, but it's a little bit unsatisfying in that, like, we don't have a solution to regret yet under information asymmetry to reducing it. So actually, some of my current ongoing work and future work is, okay, how can we actually reduce regret under information asymmetry? Can we bring in some ideas from contract design? And actually, in particular, one direction I'm really excited about is, can we bring in some ideas for mechanism design or information design? So I can give a quick, like, preview of this, where we had our principal agent game from just now, where we have, like, CMS designing a reward for the agent who responds. And then they're doing this, like, within a world of information asymmetry. But I have some current work where, which is, like, currently in submission, where we're saying, okay, what if the agent or the hospital has the opportunity to transfer over some information to the principal before the rest of the contract gets executed? And so at equilibrium, when does the agent basically prefer to reveal the additional informative variables that they have, because, like, since, whatever variables they reveal are going to inform the rest of their contract. So if you're curious about that, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. But just wanted to give, like, a quick preview of that. But yeah, overall, thank you so much for the time and for the great questions. And I'd love to have, further discussion as well. And again, just want to recognize my co-authors here, Stephen, P, and Mike. And also feel free to email me if you have other questions.
Thank you. So there were quite some questions during the presentation. Is there any other question? So the question I had, like, was about the reference population that you had.
Oh, yeah.
Is this assumption reasonable in the hospital literature, like, to have, like, this reference population? And if so, like, is the reference population like a condition with the kind of the patient that you have, or like, so it's gonna change, or is something that you have like, I don't know, some specialization over the hospitals that you may have, I don't know, like, can you develop on that? I didn't quite get how do you measure how you get this reference population?
Right. Yeah, good question. So what I was envisioning here was to have a separate, like, basically have personalized rankings for each reference population. So let's say, like, okay, for me, I'm like Asian woman, just turned 30, like, I want to know what hospitals are best for me. So if I were to say put those characteristics in, like, and say, okay, let's take the let's take X naught to be like the distribution of patients who have my demographic characteristics. Then I can say, okay, if I want to go into, like, maybe I can say, okay, what are the rankings that, like, what would be the best hospitals be for me, basically. I think, like, one way I was envisioning this too was, this is like, okay, in the health space, that's one way to think of it, where, like, okay, you can maybe put in your own characteristics and, like, get, okay, here's the best set of rankings. Here's a set of rankings that are, like, tailored to you. More widely, like, I was thinking of this kind of in the restaurant recommendation setting as well, where I run into this problem all the time where I'm trying to find a good Chinese restaurant to go to. But my preference for what a good Chinese restaurant looks like is very different than, like, what, I don't know, a lot of different American palettes are for a good Chinese restaurant. So if I want to say, okay, like, where you'll find on Google Maps, like, there's, like, all these different, there's, like, ratings where people are like, oh, the service was so bad because they didn't speak English. And, like, I don't actually care that they didn't speak English. I am fine with that. So in that case, can I reweight the ratings for my own, that like work better for me, who's, like, someone who speaks Chinese and has maybe higher spice tolerance or something. So that's kind of what I mean here, where can we, like, this, through this, like, reweighting function G, you can, this is, like, one way in which you can actually directly change the, tailor the rankings to some population or some, like, particular characteristics like that. As for, like, how to actually fit that into real systems, I haven't done that yet. I mean, here's just, like, how you do it in the math.
Right.
But yeah, that's something, like, I would like to do next.
And just one more question about your G, and you said that, like, G is easy to compute somehow, like, it's just a proportion between, like, what you, okay, between like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, as for that particular problem of just adjusting to some reference population, you can just, it's just an importance weight. So, like, it kind of has issues that come with importance weighting more broadly. So, like, if your denominator gets close to 0 in your hospitals, like, in the original population that the hospital saw, then that's going to be a problem. You may also have problems with, like, yeah, if you may have, this also may be tricky when you're estimating this mu hat 0, like, you might have to estimate, you might have, like, a smaller
Subgroup,
data
yeah.
sets for, like, estimating mu hat 0. So the more granular you get, the kind of, you get some, like, statistical difficulties that are going to show up, but they're, like, your standard ones that are going to show up in importance sampling and causal estimation.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So if there are no more questions, well, thank you again, Serena. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.